I have.
Perfect timing.
Always happens the minute before you come up to speak, you swallow something down the wrong pipe, so forgive me. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I want you to imagine yourselves on the side of a cliff. On a trail about this wide, I don't need to exaggerate, with the cliffside here and a fall of perhaps 10 meters, about 30 feet down to the rocks below. With a 50-pound pack on your back, walking along, and all of a sudden, the cliff ends. The trail stops. And I stood there, panicked. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Because if I turned this way, the pack was going to pull me down off the side of the cliff. And if I turned this way, the pack is going to hit up against the wall of the cliff. I couldn't move. Thank God for Thomas Crumb's book, 3 Deep Breaths. I took 3 deep breaths to calm myself down, focus, and try to figure out what the possibilities were that were open in front of me. And I slowly let down the pack to the ground, very carefully. And I gingerly turned around, retraced my steps, and I found where I missed the trail. Where the trail was supposed to go up the side of the cliff, where there's some hand holds there, and I had simply missed it. I went back along this very narrow trail, this path, which I was afraid to fall off on, and I gingerly again put this very heavy pack back on my back. And that's where it got interesting. Because somehow the pack felt lighter, which didn't make any sense because nobody had come and taken anything out of the pack. But as I turned around and retraced my steps, I felt a renewed sense of confidence. I knew where I was supposed to go now. Having lost the trail, I had found my path. And I think to a certain extent, I recognized only afterwards that of course nothing had changed in the pack. Something had changed in me. And what had changed in me, to a great extent, was an understanding of where I needed to go and a lightening of this burden, of this panic of not being able to move. Sometimes we have to let down our baggage, as it were. Sometimes we have to take a renewed look at where we are and where we're supposed to be going. And that experience that I just shared with you occurred in the middle of an 8-week trek across the land of Israel. I hiked the Israel National Trail, 1,000 kilometers, as Marlene mentioned, from Eilat in the south to Kibbutz Dan in the north. I did it all alone. I was 51 years old. I did it with a 50-pound pack on my back. I did it after a very difficult challenging period in my life, where I was recovering from a divorce that I hadn't looked for, that was tremendously difficult, that wasn't my choice. And I got out there and hiked this 1,000 kilometers of the trail, to a certain extent, simply to find a way to move ahead with my life. And the story that I want to share with you is the story not only of the hike along the trail, 8 miles or 20 kilometers a day, about 12 hours a day. It's a story of how, alone with my thoughts, walking hour after hour through deserts and forests, reconnecting with our shared history and our land and our people, sense of identity and connection with our land, and alone with my thoughts, with the time to reflect on that connection, on our history, on my personal journey, as it were, I went through a tremendous transformation. And what I want to share with you today is not only a description of the hike itself, but as much a description of the experience that I had and the lessons that I learned, lessons from the physical trail, which helped me tremendously to achieve that goal that I had set for myself to move on with my life, to get over the pain of my divorce, and to figure out what my next steps were on my personal journey. The truth is, Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl both reflect in their books and their life experience of turning the horror of the Shoah into a theory or a philosophy that helps to bring meaning to our lives. They said themselves in different ways that sometimes we have to put down our baggage, that sometimes we have to take a renewed look at who we are and where we're going, and that the only way to meet our personal challenges is to focus on those things which bring our life meaning. In the course of my experience of hiking the Israel Trail, I meditated on mountaintops, I cried in dry creek beds, I looked down at the ants, and I looked up to the clouds and the sky, and I experienced and rediscovered a sense of self, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection to our people and our land, and a sense of personal and national history, which to me meant everything when it came to trying to find a way to reconnect and to reestablish what I was doing here in this land with my life, and to be able to move forward. In my search for inner peace, as it were, I learned lessons on the trail itself, which, as you'll see, were translated from the physical lessons of the hike to the more philosophical, theoretical lessons that I learned that helped me to move on with my life. So let's get started on the experience of hiking through the land of Israel, on what I call my Israel Trail, which to a certain extent is all of our trails, but this is my story about hiking the trail meant so much to me. And my story starts in the desert. And the desert, the 3 weeks of hiking through the desert from the hills in Eilat, which you can see here in Canyon Shechoret, and up through Timnah and other parts of the Negev, to me the first lesson that I learned, as you can imagine standing here looking at this rather, it's not that it's not colorful, this landscape, but that it's a little bit overwhelming, let's say.
Bleak.
Bleak is a good word. Drab is another good word. That the desert, it's devoid to a certain extent of life. But the experience that I had walking minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day in the desert was somehow extraordinarily uplifting. It gave me time to contemplate, but more than that, what it started with, even from that first day in the hills of Eilat, was a deep sense of humility. This sense of being lost in the midst of this nothingness could have been frightening. But instead it was, somewhat interestingly, calming. It gave me a sense of perspective. Not that my problems don't exist, not that we don't all have challenges that we have to face, but that somehow my problems, as important and painful as they were to me, were just one element in a large expanse of not just space, but time. And that perspective and that humility that it afforded me enabled me to step back a little bit from the suffering that I was feeling and to begin to appreciate the surroundings, the world around me. It gave me this feeling that we're simply all part of something bigger than ourselves. Now, I want to stop for a second in the telling of the story and recognize something important here, because Marlene and I and Ellen and I and a few others had some conversations, and I know, where's Rena? Rena, are you still here? Did you leave already? Okay, Rena is a tour guide, and I were talking about, oh, there you are, sorry. I'm sorry, Rena, I apologize. You live here in Israel. Therefore, I don't need to tell you necessarily all the details of every single place I visited, because many of the places that we'll talk about, you visited. But I hope that in this description and with some of the pictures, it will remind you either of places you've been or connect you with places that you've heard of, even if you haven't been there. But I simply wanted to take a moment to recognize that for many of you, I'll be describing places which you visited and experiences that perhaps you've had yourselves. But for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of hiking through the Eilat Mountains, I've included also, assuming it will work, a few videos. Just for fun. Just to give the feeling, which I often want to do when I'm speaking with groups who are not here in Israel, of what it really feels like to be on the top of a mountain and feel this silence, surrounded by nothingness, no people. Here you can see no shrubbery, no trees, no birds, no beetles even. And it's that silence, that's surrounded by everything and nothing at the same time, that is remarkably liberating. And that gave me the kind of perspective that I was describing, but went one step further. And the step further that it goes when you're in this desert in particular. This is not the Sahara. It's not the Mojave Desert. This is the Negev. This is, in fact, this picture is just at the area above Midbar Tzin. Anybody remember from a few Parshiot ago, the children of Israel wandering through Midbar Tzin? Now, we're not 100% sure. In fact, we're pretty sure that what we call Midbar Tzin in the Negev is not the same Midbar Tzin in the Sinai that the children of Israel walked through. But my issue here and then when I was hiking was not the historicity of, is this the actual place where the children of Israel wandered? It was the emotional impact of wandering the desert here in the Middle East, in the general area where our ancestors wandered. And it shouldn't surprise us that we're reading in this week's Parsha, actually, which we'll come back to in a minute, because I don't think, Marlene, you mentioned, but today happens to be my Hebrew birthday. Thank you. One of the things that I learned years ago in becoming more observant is that our Hebrew birthdays are a time of reflection. They're meant to be like a mini Yom Kippur. When I went to shul this morning, I was focused on some of the same kinds of contemplations and reflections that I had there in the desert. And it reminded me, in reading the Torah this morning, of Moshe in the desert, how many of our national, religious, and cultural experiences, our heritage, is filled with desert experiences. And the kind of humility that I learned in the desert, walking day after day in this silence, all alone. I'm not suggesting that I have any connection to Moshe Rabbeinu any more than the rest of us, but that's one of the things that we learned, that we know that our tradition teaches us, that Moshe was chosen as the leader of the Jewish people for a primary characteristic, and that was his modesty, his humility, his lack of egotistic sense of his own importance. And this is something we've seen again and again, by the way. Some of you I know are Americans, some are Brits, Canadian, or what have you, but we Americans tell our children the stories of George Washington, about his humility and his modesty. We have other role models like Gandhi and others throughout history who have demonstrated how modesty, how humility is one of the keys, not necessarily specific to leadership, but without question, one of the keys to wisdom and one of the keys to any sense of conciliatory approaches to conflict, whether it's interpersonal or otherwise. Walking, sleeping, camping alone in the desert was such an important part of my trail and my story that I find myself sometimes almost hesitant to move on to the rest of the story, because there's so much more that I could and want to share with you. I'm going to share one more video, and perhaps as we watch, some of you might be able to call out where this part of the trek took place. Because one or two aspects of it, in a second when you see I turn around, should be recognizable to anybody who's hiked in this area. We're still in the desert. Now we're north of Timnah. We're not at the Maktesh yet. Sorry, we actually passed the Maktesh. I take it back. So it's not a challenge test, but what you saw in the corner, which was the recognizable element, was Hod Akev. This is on the way from Sde Boker to Ein Akev. Have you been to Ein Akev? One of the kinds of tours that, should you choose as a group, hopefully motivated by our conversation about the wonders of hiking the Israel Trail, one of the more accessible tours for people of our age who may not want to be doing 20 kilometers, certainly not all alone, probably not with a 50-pound pack on your back, but nevertheless possible to do in a half a day's walk, is down through this relatively flat desert area to a beautiful spring called Ein Akev, which you can see here was one of the times when I met the challenge that I received from my son-in-law to jump into every single spring that I passed in the entire length of the journey, which I did except for once when it was hailing in the hills of Jerusalem. And I figured if he wanted to jump in a spring in the middle of the freezing cold hail, he could, but I was going to leave that to him. One of the experiences that I want to share with you, which relates to our parsha specifically, relates not only to the humility that I felt, the first lesson that I learned along the trail, but to the second lesson, which is a feeling of great gratitude or appreciation. At first, for the privilege that I had to take this walk through the land of our ancestors, and then the gratitude that I was filled with for those who helped me. You'll see a few pictures as we go on of some of the angels, the trail angels, who hosted me, or who gave me supplies, or who helped me along the way. And as I walked day after day contemplating my life and where it was going, one of the elements that kept returning to me, whether it was walking with the walking sticks that my daughter-in-law had loaned me, or being appreciative of the Snickers bar that my daughter had given me to keep with me as a treat, or the gratitude I had for the company that I worked for that gave me the 2 months of vacation. As I was discussing with one of you earlier, it's not easier for some of us to just take 2 months off and walk the land of Israel. Or the gratitude that I felt for my parents and the support they'd given me, or my friends, or the rest of the family through the 2.5 years of the suffering and pain that I'd experienced leading up to the divorce. The feelings that I had and the sense of gratitude were very, very powerful. And those were accompanied with a sense of recognition that this is where my life is or was, and that I had to accept that. And there were times on the side of a hill or a mountain, like this one, the Carbolet, the hardest day on the trail, where I found myself asking over and over again, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Why have you set yourself up in a situation where you're endangering yourself, cut off from all civilization?
What time of year was it?
I left in February, about 2 weeks before the beginning of the usual season, February 16th. Here already it's the beginning of March as I started up the Carbolit. I want to share with you one element of this. This is just fun. There were different aspects of wildlife that I met along the trail, and it was fun to take these videos without any intention necessarily ever to give a lecture about the trip. It wasn't just people you met, but bobcats and foxes and jackals, snakes, and the Tzvi of Eretz Yisrael along the Carbolit, where you're walking, if you can imagine yourself, on the edge of that cliff with the wind about to blow you over the side, trying to balance because the trail isn't even flat. And at one point, I was so afraid that I was going to fall that I sat down and I seriously contemplated calling up my son and saying to him, call out 669, call out the rescue services, send a helicopter, come pick me up. What am I doing here? Is this crazy? Instead, I basically looked around and I said to myself, Aryeh, this is where you are. You're on the side of a cliff. You can't blame anybody else for bringing you here, and you can't rely on anybody else to get you off the side of this cliff. You have to accept this is the situation you're in and figure out a way to move forward. And that lesson, learned on the side of a cliff on the hike, came to me so powerfully that night in my tent that I wrote in my journal, Aryeh, you never expected to find yourself divorced. You never expected to find yourself alone. This is the situation you're in. This is the cliff you're sitting on. You can't rely on anybody else to come and save you from this. And that acceptance, that acknowledgement of the reality that I found myself in was the third key, the third lesson that I learned along the trail that helped me move on with my life. What I want to share with you, which was related to our Parsha today, I don't often go into these details. If you're interested, you can get the book. And I go into some detail about both the experiences that led me to this and the meditative practice that I had started earlier before the trail that connected these elements together. I spoke about humility, modesty. I spoke about acceptance and gratitude. And every morning I had a meditative practice that comes from our Parsha of this week, where Moshe Rabbeinu is standing at the sneh, at the burning bush, and he asks God, who are you? And God's answer is so mysterious. It's hard to translate into English that reflects the Hebrew idiom. Hashem, God says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. In this week's Parsha today, he says, I am what I am, or I will be as I will be, or I am that which I am. I exist, and that existence is part of the universe and the reality we live in. And I took that phrase as a meditative mantra, if you will, which every morning helped me to focus on this element of reality and acceptance of the reality that we're in. And I immediately followed that with a meditative practice focused on the phrase and the prayer that many of us are familiar with, however many times we either do or don't pray, once a day or once a year or what have you. Modeh ani lifanecha. We say in our, upon waking, I am grateful to you, God or the universe, or however you want to define it, for my existence, for everything that I have around me that I appreciate. And I found myself in the desert developing this meditative practice, connecting the humility and modesty and acceptance of reality as we know it to the gratitude, modeh ani, for all the amazing things that we have in our lives that we should be appreciative of. And that gave me strength, not only to move on every day with the hike itself, but it began a process that enabled me, eventually at the end of the hike, to move on with my life after my divorce. I want to move through a few pictures of this desert experience to give you the feeling of some of the things that welled up inside me, which of course didn't necessarily happen every day, but were part and parcel of the experience I had of connecting both my experience to the walking the land, to our people and our history. And one of the reasons that I took this photo itself, this specific one of this flower, is that this was the first spring flower that I had seen after the drab and desolate weeks in the desert. I saw this flower and I cried, because it was the first sign of life, the first sign of spring. It was the first color that I'd seen after weeks of trudging through the desert. And of course you can imagine, because you can tell already just in the beginnings of this discussion, how I kind of wax poetic and I have an emotional or romantic side to me. I also saw this and said, it's a sign of life. It's a sign that there is life after the bleakness of the desert or the pain and suffering of a divorce. A picture of my host in the town of Dimona, a member of the Black Hebrews of the African Israelite community of Jerusalem, an old friend, Prince Emmanuel Ben Yehuda, who hosted me for one of the Shabbatot. I could write a whole book about the 7 Shabbatot I spent on the Shvil, each one unique and amazing in its own way, and contributing to my appreciation and sense of gratitude for all those who've helped me, not only on the trail, but in my experience leading up to the divorce. A quick question, just because, again, we're here in Israel, and I know some of you have done some touring. Anybody recognize what we're looking at now? Nobody. And by the way, am I the only one hot? Is it because I'm up here that it's hotter than for you down there?
The air conditioner was giving off cold air, so we switched back to the one that was giving off hot air.
Okay.
Okay,
Maybe in a few minutes we can turn it off. Just because it's hotter up here because the air conditioner vent comes out here. Nobody recognizes this. So here's a different question. How many of you, because we're all Israelis, how many of you know what is the largest nature reserve in Israel? Throw out a name, what you might think. The Maktesh, good guess. People often say the Yehudiya. En Gedi often is a very good guess. These are places that you've probably visited. The largest nature reserve in the land of Israel is the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. Have any of you ever heard of or knew that we even had something called the Nature Reserve, the Judean Desert National Nature Reserve? Nobody's ever heard of it. It's the largest nature reserve in the country. And do you know why? That's why. There's nothing there. It's like a it's like a moonscape. Rocks. There's not even bugs. It was in the Judean desert that I had one of the most important and transformative days on the hike, where I started, or I continued, but I started the beginning of the eventual process of healing, where I actually wrote a song walking through the desert, in the Judean desert. And one of the reasons for that, related to this meditative practice that I was describing, is that in the desert, especially one as desolate as this, there's no distractions. No wonder that the prophets of Israel found inspiration in the desert. I don't want to wax too poetic. I didn't have, an out-of-body experience, but I definitely experienced something of an epiphany. In the desert where there are no distractions, I was connected. I was connected to God. I was connected to our people, our prophets, and the children of Israel wandering through the desert. I was connected to the universe in a way that was so emotionally powerful that it opened my soul up, literally, to song. And for the first time since my college years, I wrote a song, which I'm not going to sing for you now. but which actually I did upload to YouTube at one point for my former parents-in-law. I hope and I think, having said this to you now, if you go to my website and go to my YouTube channel, I hope that I actually locked it with a password, because I don't necessarily want it to be entirely public. The truth is that that kind of aloneness in the desert, like the Judean desert, could have been frightening. But I took that night in my tent the concept of aloneness and played with the word. Because aloneness, if you just separate it out, can be understood as all oneness. Something that I'm sure I didn't make up. I'm sure somebody before me thought of that, but I hadn't heard of that before, and that tickled me. Not as deeply as some of the amazing wordplay that we do in Hebrew that brings real meaning out of the shorish of a word, but it helped me to understand why I moved from feeling alone and lonely to feeling uplifted and connected to our history and our people, to my family and those who were supportive of me, and to actually the rest of humanity. And the next night, I ended up staying at a trail angel, a family who had dedicated a Bedouin tent in their backyard in Arad to the memory of their son who had passed away on a hiking accident. And I was talking to them about the connection that I felt the day before in the Judean desert. And it was something that connected us as Jews, as lovers of the land, in a way that was just as powerful as being alone in the desert was. I want to take a little bit of a break from the heaviness of these lessons that I learned and share with you a few more steps of the hike itself. And then we'll come back to the last 2 lessons of 5 that I learned on the trail and wind up with, we'll have ample time for questions and answers at the end. Some of you may be familiar with this area. And again, I'm not testing you, but I thought that was a video. I apologize. That was the Yatir forest. That was the first forest that you get to in the northern edge of the Negev. The first time that you see trees in abundance. A little bit of Switzerland almost. And then we come to the week where I literally circumnavigated my hometown of Beit Shemesh for a week, wandering through the hills that became ever more familiar to me of the Judean mountains, in an experience which was, I suppose, unique specifically in a way that many others who hike the Israel Trail don't necessarily have this kind of single-minded focus. But I literally walked around Beit Shemesh for an entire week and never stepped foot in my house, didn't come to visit or to take a shower, allowed myself to focus on the experience of walking up the Roman road to Jerusalem, and yes, taking a moment to have a selfie and send it out to my friends, and I think I even posted on Facebook with some relatively off-color reference to the Romans. Where are they now? But we're here hiking the Israel Trail, hiking up into the hills of Jerusalem, getting rained on, and as I mentioned, experiencing hail in March. Hail in the middle of the Jerusalem forest that came on so fast that I didn't have time to cover up myself or my backpack with my rain cover. Got completely soaked, and thank God for the trail angels of Hadassah Hospital, staff at Hadassah Hospital who keep a room aside for hikers on Shvil Yisrael to come and, like many other trail angels, have a shower and have a bed, a warm bed. In the midst of the rain, you can imagine how amazing that was. And then being surprised, even though I didn't go home to Beit Shemesh, my kids arranged to meet me that evening and arranged a dinner with my closest friends who came to T.E.A.M, to a restaurant. Imagine for a second how incongruous that was, how surreal. I'm hiking already for 3.5 weeks. Haven't been in a restaurant, haven't sat at a table. I'm wearing my hiking clothes. And they're all normal life. We're going out for dinner. It's something that normal people do in the middle of the week. It's not a big deal. And I'm wonderfully happy to be surrounded by my family and friends and feeling yet at the same time completely alone. I'm in a different place than they are. Wonderful to reconnect with them. Emotional, and yet very difficult also, because it simply reminded me again of how alone I was just a few weeks after my divorce. I continued on hiking through the hills of Jerusalem in the rain and the cold, as you can see. Called up my daughter, who was 22 at the time, just out of the army, who was at home, living in my home, driving my car, working right after the army. And I said to her, this is silly. I couldn't find a trail angel for the next night. All the ones that were on the list were busy or weren't available or didn't have room. I said, you know what, Moria? Come pick me up. 20 minutes from my home, you understand. Come pick me up. I'll come home. I'll have a shower. I'll sleep in my bed. I'll do a load of laundry. And then you'll take me in the next morning back to the trail, just like other trail angels do. What did Moria say to me? Ani lo marsha. She said, I'm not letting you. I mean, what are you talking about? She was right. Because this was part of the experience of the trail, and to come home and to have to deal with mail or a leaky water pipe or any of those things that we're familiar with in our everyday life would have changed the experience that I was undergoing. Now, I will take a moment to say that there are some advantages. I said I did the trail at 51, and most of you recognize that this is something normally that the 21-year-old crowd does after the army, hiking through the land or what have you. There's some advantages. There are many disadvantages to doing it at 51, believe me. There's some advantages, and one was when my daughter said, no, I'm not going to come pick you up, and I couldn't find another trail angel, I called up the Shoresh guest house. I asked them if they had a room. They had a room. I could afford a room for a night for 300 shekels. I had a very nice night in the motel at Shoresh, which most 21-year-olds obviously couldn't allow themselves to do. I then spent a Shabbat in the Shetach, in the forest at Mesilat Zion, again, literally 10 minutes drive from my home in Beit Shemesh, where friends came on Motzei Shabbat to visit with me, to sit around the campfire, to read the Megillah because it was Purim. And I spent the evening around the campfire with some other very close friends who, in a tragic turn of circumstances, had lost their daughter, their 22-year-old daughter, in a car accident 4 months after her wedding. And her funeral was on the day that I gave my former wife the get. I went from giving her the get in the Jerusalem rabbinate in tears, immediately driving as fast as I could to make it in time. Okay?
Sorry.
As long as you're okay, that's...
Yeah.
Got some water or something?
I have... That's okay, don't apologize. Not the first time that somebody has fallen asleep when I've given a talk. I'm just glad that you weren't hurt. We can take a little bit of a break. I'm going to ask you to turn the heat down. Sorry, it's much warmer up here than it is. Thank you. Maybe turn the other heater on instead of this one, because I know there are two of them. I was just going to share with you that my very close friends, Jeremy and Mandy, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. We spent 2 hours around the campfire that night, that Saturday night, which is 4 weeks into the trail, halfway through the experience, talking in depth about our shared pain and difficulties, and about these themes of humility and acceptance and gratitude, even in spite of the challenges that we're facing. Gratitude for those aspects of our life which of course we're so appreciative of. That was the middle of the trek. I then did something that, if you've read the Red Guide, the kind of not official but authoritative guide to hiking the Israel Trail, Jacob Sar, the author, recommends to people who do it in the season that I did. You asked when I had hiked, and it was in early spring, to jump up to the north. He says go to Tel Aviv and then jump up to the north and then start hiking southward. Why? Because when you do that, you're not going to miss the flowering of the spring bouquets, the spring flowers in the north. And for me, there was another reason to do that. And that was because I was very, very interested in the idea that instead of ending at the north in Kibbutz Dan, right before Pesach, where very few of my friends or family would want to drive 4 hours up north to meet me and celebrate and come literally a day before Seder night, that I would actually be able to walk in a southerly direction and end up walking home, walking from the trail to my home in Beit Shemesh. So I started up north and started there, as you saw it, in Kibbutz Dan, and started to head in a southerly direction. First actually going west towards Metula and going along the border with Lebanon engendered a number of different elements, thought processes that I was going through that led to the fourth lesson that I learned on the trail. And walking along the Lebanon border, if you're familiar with it, makes you think, and those of us who live in Israel recognize this, what's the first thing that we think of when we go north? I don't mean the scenery and the beauty and the flowers. First thing we think of is Hezbollah. Part of the reality of being in Israel is that when you think of that. It's one of the first things that come to you. Whether it's looking across the border and actually seeing a Hezbollah flag in one of the villages literally 400 meters away from you, or remembering the experiences we've had year after year of different rocket attacks, the Second Lebanon War, where I actually served in the IDF spokesman's unit there in one of the areas, Sasa, very near where the trail goes. That's where my thoughts went on the first day as I started walking along the border with Lebanon. And not least because the village of Rajar, which is on the Lebanese border, and some of you are nodding, you're familiar with it, a village of Alawite Arabs, which ended up after, and I won't go into the long story of it, becoming Israeli citizens, and yet with an anomaly of history and map making, is divided down the middle by the blue line that separates sovereign Israel from Lebanon. Very difficult political story, but because of that, my thoughts wandered to the Arab-Israel conflict. And in thinking about how we can possibly come to some sort of reconciliation with our Arab neighbors, began a process for me of thinking about how much suffering has been experienced in our region, and how one of the keys for the Arabs and for us as Jews, one of the keys to any real potential peace between us is going to be the ability to forgive the other. To forgive the other for the 100 or more years of hostility, violent animosity by the Arabs to the whole idea of Jews returning to our ancestral homeland. And also for the Arabs to reach a sense of forgiveness, not only that we exist and insist on our return to our sovereign enterprise of the creation and living in our Jewish state, but to forgive us for defending ourselves and injuring or killing many of them in our defensive military operations, and or taking over land that they had felt was supposed to be theirs. I'm not going into the arguments of whether it was or wasn't, is or isn't. But my thoughts went in that direction. And possibly or probably because my thoughts went in that direction, I started thinking about forgiveness as a theme. Now, on the mundane level, because as I said to you, the lessons that I learned that helped me to get over my challenge, personal challenge I was facing, they all came from the shvil itself, the physical experience of the hike. There are many things when you are hiking Shvil Yisrael that you get frustrated with or angry over. From directions that are erroneous or lead you astray, to missing the path itself, instructions that make no sense, or even just my anger at myself, as I mentioned before, of asking myself, what are you doing? Why are you doing this crazy thing? And the hardships that it presented, the physical hardships every day of the heat and the exhaustion and the difficulty of sleeping on hard or cold rocks at night, etc. That's on the very mundane level. But there were other areas where I had to start developing this capacity to forgive. To forgive myself for making the decision to hike the trail, that was easy. To forgive Yaakov Sar, the author of the Red Guide, when he kept leading me astray, that was easy. To start to forgive myself for the mistakes that I had made in my life, the mistakes that I had made in my marriage, that was more difficult. The most difficult, and one of the other transformative days and events in my trail took place here on Nachal, anybody? Nachal Snir, Nechatzbani, on the border with Lebanon, where I used to take my children on family T.E.A.M, probably a half a dozen times when the kids were small. And the kids loved to jump into this specific area where the water comes through, and it's like a water slide, but it's also like a pool, and you can swim around and come out of the current and spend hours there. And I took off my backpack. I took off my clothes. I did look to make sure there was nobody else around. About propriety being an important thing, and I jumped in the water. And it was like being Ma'in Chaim, the living waters of the mikveh, of Gan Eden. I came out of that water, literally rebirthed.
Wet.
And I experienced
You
a
came
sense,
out
I
wet?
heard, wet, yes, I did come out of the water wet. I experienced a sense of rebirth. And not for the first time, and not for the last time, as I've already mentioned, I cried. And I cried not this time from sadness, but somehow, being in that water, I was tremendously sad, recognizing that no, we would never be here again as a family. We would never have another peak experience of incredible, simple enjoyment as a family together, of jumping into this water and frolicking. But I came out of the water realizing I had finally started the process of real forgiveness of my former wife. Recognizing I always had, on an intellectual level, that she of course had every right to make the decision she made. And I should take a moment simply to describe the fact that we had a 28-year wonderful marriage. A marriage that our friends and our family recognized as something not just that was a partnership full of love and friendship, but something to emulate. And when she said she wanted to leave, it was a surprise not only to me, also in the end to her, to all of our friends and family. And I didn't mention that earlier, but it's an important element of an understanding of just why this divorce was so incredibly painful.
Thank you so much.
All divorces are painful, but some come after a process of difficulties in trying to reconciliate, and some come out of the blue, and that's what this was. And that's one of the reasons why the whole process was difficult for me to come to terms with. And that's why reaching a level of forgiveness where truly, not just intellectually, I was able to acknowledge the right of another person to make a decision she felt was right for her life, but the forgiveness, the deep, not just empathy and sympathy, but understanding and heartfelt forgiveness for her having hurt me so greatly, transformed my experience for the rest of the trail into one that was looking forward rather than being full of resentment and anger and looking backward. You can imagine that the process from humility to acceptance, and from acceptance of the reality to the gratitude and appreciation that I felt for all of the wonders in my life, including not just the privilege to hike the trail, but to be privileged of that which we're all a part of, this wonderful experience of returning to sovereignty for the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland. But all of those things together, the humility, the acceptance, and the gratitude, opened my heart up to the ability to forgive. And having forgiven allowed me to move on not only with the trek itself, but eventually with my life. I walked then along the Baram forest, which some of you may be familiar with. And I was speaking with one of you before about how we can find ways for people of our age to take day trips along Shvil Yisrael without going into the frightening cliffsides of the Karbolit or Hashchorat or Amram or the others. This is one of the examples which I would highly recommend through the Baram forest of finding ways to hike Shvil Yisrael without it being too physically taxing. I want to share with you a few of the pictures of the north which you may be familiar with. But some of them are of what I would call hidden gems. That, for instance, in the middle of March, I walked through this Baram forest completely alone, which is a bit surprising when you think of March. There are people out taking date Tiyulim all the time. But when I was writing my book, and I went through my journal, I added up, out of 48 days of hiking, I was alone from morning to night on 12 of those days, where I didn't see a single soul. And what surprised me was how many of those days occurred in the north, not only in the desert in the south. And I would highly recommend, for anybody who's interested, the Baram forest, or Nahal Dishon before it, which were areas for me which were literally unknown and I think underappreciated gems in the north. Another little break in the intensity of my story and the intensity of the telling of it. I took a break. It's another example of the privileges of hiking at age 51 instead of 21. I took a break at the winery called the Adir Winery in the Dalton Industrial Park. I make wine. I don't think I mentioned that, and I don't think Marlene, you mentioned it when you introduced me, but I know it was in the description, in the promotion of the talk. And it became something of a theme for me in the hike to stop at every winery that was along the way. And this, particularly the Adir Winery, is one of my favorites, where I stopped for breakfast, including some wine tasting, as you saw there, before I continued on. There were times on the trail that I want to share with you, and one anecdote to demonstrate it, where I stumbled across almost innocuous representations of what it means for those of us who chose to move here, to make our home here, and the connection we have with the land. One of them was here in the Baram forest, where I was walking along under the trees in a flat area by a stream, and I stumbled along a tomb, a blue covered tomb surrounded by a fence. And I don't have a picture of it, but I'm just describing for you that I stopped, I looked at it, I saw a plaque, and the plaque said, Kever Yeshayahu ben Amos, the tomb of Yeshayahu, the son of Amos. Now, I've been religiously observant for 30 years, but I had no idea who that was. I figured some person who lived up north. So there was reception there, so I turned my phone on and I looked it up, and it turns out this is the tomb of the prophet Isaiah. In the middle of a forest, on a dirt path that's not even accessible by a car. The prophet Isaiah, swords and plowshares, Isaiah. I could not believe, it wasn't a pilgrimage site. I mean, you'd think hundreds of thousands of people go to Har Meron, to Yochanan ben Zakkai's kever. And here is the kever of one of the greatest prophets in Israel, alone in the middle of a forest, tended and marked, but no pilgrimage site. I put my bag down, as you can imagine, decided to take a break. I said some prayers there at his tomb. By the way, just for the record, later on, we're doing some research for the book. Apparently there's an argument among archaeologists and historians that there's a tomb in Jerusalem, also understood to be Yeshayahu's kever. So for me, as you can imagine, that wasn't the important point of the emotional experience at the time of coming across even something that was supposed to be, whether it really was or not, the tomb of one of our greatest prophets. That is the difference between people. I saw that you had the book here in your lending library, Eat, Pray, Love. Gilbert's book about her travels in getting over meeting her own personal challenges. Some of you may be familiar with the book Wild by Cheryl Strayed, who hiked the Pacific Crest Trail to recover from her own, or to deal with her own personal challenges. My book is kind of, I guess, a male version of that genre. It's obviously much more than a tale of the trail, as it were. But what I'm sharing with you, and I think the kind of thing that you uniquely can appreciate, is that hiking the Israel Trail is not the same as the Appalachian Trail, or the Pilgrim's Trail in Spain and Portugal, or the Pacific Crest Trail, because this is our Israel Trail. And you don't stumble across a prophet of Israel, even if in the most beautiful mountain of West Virginia on the Appalachian Trail. And I will admit also, having mentioned the trail angels, who are private individuals or kibbutzim like this one, which is the kibbutz Baram, who open their homes to hikers on the Shvil and give them a place to sleep, as I said, or do their laundry or a hot meal. This is the trail angel apartment in kibbutz Baram. Look at the amount of food on the shelves, and there's a sign there saying, please take, please help yourselves. Coming into here was coming into a 5-star hotel. They had sheets on the beds. Mela to have a bed, most trail angels supply you. Sheets and pillows and shampoo and conditioner. It was like being in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Also a unique element of hiking the Israel Trail. There's nothing like it on any other trail in the world, where people open their private homes for no fee, for free. There are little huts on the Appalachian Trail, by the way, little 3-sided huts with a broom and a mattress that volunteers maintain, which is terrific. And I would like to hike the Appalachian Trail one day, and I'm sure I'll appreciate the huts. It's nothing like the warmth and connection that we have as one big family, as the Jewish people or the Israeli people hiking the Israel Trail. One of the other unique elements of hiking the Israel Trail is represented by this photo, which you can't see at a glance, but this happens to be Arab Muslim teenagers on a tiyul from their school in the south outside of Beersheba, who, while they were waiting for their bus and I was waiting for my trail angel to pick me up, I traveled, if you didn't notice that in one of the pictures of me with a pack, with a little 3/4 size guitar. As if my pack wasn't heavy enough, I took for the last 4 weeks a little guitar and played it occasionally at night, what have you. And here in the parking lot, waiting for their bus, and I was waiting for my ride, I had picked up the guitar to play for myself. And music often connects people. And some of them recognized the Simon and Garfunkel song that I was singing and came to sing with me. We struck up a conversation. These Arab Muslim kids, educated in the Israeli school system, in Arabic of course, had never heard of the Israel Trail, couldn't understand why a Jew would want to be hiking the land of Israel. And we ended up, about 10 or 15 of us, having about a 30-minute conversation about the whole concept they'd never been exposed to of the Jewish people, Jews as a national, civilizational, ethnic identity, not just Judaism as a religion. The Jewish people's connection to this land going back 3,500 years. The very idea of the legitimacy of Israel's founding. Because of that connection and the idea of an indigenous people returning to the soil of our ancestral homeland, as opposed to a colonialist enterprise having been set up out of guilt by the Europeans over the Holocaust. It was not an argument, and I didn't go on some polemic. They asked what I was doing. I answered. They'd never heard of the trail. They couldn't understand. We then talked. I mentioned the issue of our land. We're talking in Hebrew, of course, which itself is its own fascinating element of an Arab Muslim having a conversation with a Jewish Israeli, and their common language is Hebrew. But it was a very important part of my trail that I met many Arabs, Muslims and Christians, Bedouin, Druze, and others. And do you know what? Just like the Israelis that would pass me by on the trail and say, "Hey, Shvilist, Shvili Israel, are you hiking the Israel Trail?" And I'd say, "Ken, yes." And they'd say, "Kol hakavod, more power to you, good for you." So did every Bedouin, every Arab, Muslim, or Christian that I passed on the trail, shopkeepers, walking through their villages or what have you. And I traveled, as you might have seen, with a big Israeli or a small Israeli pack on my back. Flag, thank you. It's a good thing that you're here. Connecting with our people was as much an important part of hiking the Israel Trail as connecting with our land. And it's another reason that I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in taking this kind of a walk, whether as a day trip or a few days or even more. Taking another bit of a break in the story itself, we moved south in the second to last week of the trail. Do you remember that story I started with? The experience of being on the side of a cliff where the trail just stopped because I missed? That's this cliff. The trail goes here, up the side of the cliff. Do you see the handles? It's a bit hard to make out, but there are metal handles on the side of the cliff. Talk about needing to forgive somebody. How come the trail organizers didn't put a big sign here saying, "Go that way"? But it was along there, you can see this path continues there, that I got to the edge of the cliff and couldn't move and couldn't go further. Walking down Nachal Amud towards the Kinneret, I didn't meet just interesting people, but I also was blocked every now and then by elements of nature that I couldn't get around. This fellow, actually, I literally said out loud, "You're on my trail. Get off my trail." It only took about 5 seconds for me to reflect. You know what? He's probably, half a ton? And he was here before me. I'm going to go through the weeds, get a little bit scratched up, and go around him. I kind of wish that he had ended up like this, but that's just a little bit of an element to show you the kind of things that I met along the trail. And this is another, one of the reasons I connected these two pictures is if you can imagine, you're walking along and this is what you see. You're in the middle of nature, and you end up at a trail angel who happened to have a zimmer that night. Wonderful people, if you ever get to Nachliel, please look up Shmuel and Hannah Veffer, who have a wonderful little zimmer there, as you can see, who I thought they were giving me a room for the night as friends, as trail angels. They gave me one of their zimmer rooms, which was, as you can imagine, just an incredible pinook, spoiling me in the course of the experience of being out in the wilderness. Because this is the usual way that I either slept or had my coffee. Like I said, I wanted to take a little bit of a break from the intensity of the lessons before we get to our last lesson. Wandering around the north of Israel was an important element of my coming to terms with not only the forgiveness that I felt towards my former wife, or to God for putting me in the position that I was put in, or to myself, as I said, for the mistakes that I had made, but also made me think of the history and the issues that I mentioned already about our conflict with our neighbors, and also gave me some historical perspective in wandering through. Anybody recognize this?
Chipori?
The mosaic from T.E.A.M, exactly. The history that we have here as a people was obviously deepened by almost every element, every place that I passed and walked through. Some of these are just fun to kind of break up the intensity of the discussion of the experiences that I was having. We get now to the Carmel, to the top of the Carmel, which you may recognize and you may not recognize because there are no trees there anymore. This whole area is rejuvenating itself after the horrendous fire there. But for me to hike to the top of the Carmel and find myself in the midst of shrubbery and brush and not trees was a little bit disturbing, disconcerting, and gave me a little bit of pause also for an understanding of, I mean, it's a pithy phrase, but it's a little bit casual, the cycle of life, of the rejuvenation of a forest after such a tremendous fire. But there was more to it than that, because at the top of the Carmel you can see the sea. And I'm not embarrassed to share with you once again, I don't actually normally mention that I cry so often in the telling of this tale. When I got to the top of the Carmel and saw the sea, I burst into tears. And maybe it's because I grew up in California and I have such memories of going to the sea with my parents, or maybe it's because I took my kids to the sea here at the Mediterranean year after year, or maybe it's because, as I discovered in doing research for my book, that there's something about the sea which is understood and known in psychology to be uplifting, to be relaxing, because of the endless possibilities that you see spread out before you when you look at the constant motion and the endless horizon of the sea. But for me, this was the beginning of my coming home, which is ironic because, as I mentioned, I spent a week circumnavigating Beit Shemesh. You would have thought I would have felt, and I did feel at home in the hills of Jerusalem, the Judean hills, but when I crested that top of the Carmel and saw the sea, I realized not only that I was going to complete this journey, that I had gone for 6 weeks, I only had 2, even 1.5 weeks ahead of me, but somehow I knew I had reached already a level of understanding of myself that I was going to reach the end of my own personal journey of getting over the pain of the divorce. One of the reasons that I shot the videos that I shot, thinking I would be sharing them with friends and family, not standing on a stage and showing them to groups of people who are interested in some of these experiences, was to see to try and help you to experience the actual hike itself, which I can talk about a lot, but when you feel coming up over the sand and reaching the sea as I did here, the exhilaration, the end of the day, having hiked up the Carmel and down the Carmel and across through Zichron Yaakov and through that Arab village of Jekr al-Jizr, just north of Caesarea, where again the fellows who I stopped for a cup of coffee at the little kiosk refused to let me pay for it. An Arab Muslim village which has a wonderful history, if you're not familiar with it, of cooperation and protection in the War of Independence of their Jewish neighbors in the area, where they wouldn't let me pay for my coffee once they understood that I wasn't just a casual day hiker, but that I was hiking Shvil Yisrael. But the video helps you to experience a little taste of the feeling that I had as I crested that hill and came to the sea. And we come then to the last week, to the final week of the trail, as I walked down the coast and made my way, both literally and figuratively, home. Some of the aspects of the trail, which many people are not familiar with, go through urban areas. And it's a little bit funny to think that you're hiking this wilderness hike, and here you are on a bridge over Route 2, going up between Tel Aviv and Haifa. And yet that too was part of the trail. As Bill Bryson says in his book, A Walk in the Woods, about hiking the Appalachian Trail, that at first he resented going into a local village to resupply, and then he came to realize that that was part of the experience also. And hiking the Israel Trail is not just about nature, and it's not just about the physical challenge, and it's not just about the people you meet on the trail. It's also walking through little towns, or even larger towns like Hadera, and recognizing they have a history, they have a relevance too, to us and our connection to our land and our people. There are so many stories that I could tell, but I want to wrap up because I want to leave time for questions and answers. And so I want to bring you with me on this last week of the trail as I came to one final lesson that helped me in my understanding of what the trail had done for me, and to a certain extent brought me to the point where I thought maybe I'll share with others some of these lessons, because perhaps there are others facing their own personal challenges who, through the story of my hike on the trail, might benefit from some of the lessons that I learned, which aren't anything new. Not that I discovered some new amazing discovery or a theory of psychology like Viktor Frankl did, but perhaps there's something new in the telling of it via the vehicle of the Israel Trail experience that might give some people some pause and ability to connect to the transformative experience I had, and then be able to help them meeting their own challenges. When I spent my last Shabbat on the trail, as I said, I could write a book about the 7 Shabbatot I spent. It was alone on the Sharon beach, Chof Sharon, which, by the way, isn't legal, I discovered the next morning, but that's a different story. And the ranger came at 6 o'clock and yelled at me, "Go, leave, you're not allowed to be here." I spent a beautiful and quiet Shabbat, which then on the day of Shabbat gave me, as a religiously observant Jew in Israel, an amazing window into what, for the non-observant community, what amazing community recreation there is on a beach on Shabbat. And people came over to me while I was making Kiddush to have me make Kiddush with them when they saw that I was making Kiddush. And the connections were phenomenal. And as I said, a whole other story itself. But one of the things that came to me on that Shabbat, in recognizing that I was completing this goal I had set for myself, to hike the Israel Trail, was how important goals are, to have a sense of purpose. As Viktor Frankl talks about in his book, which I read years ago but only reconnected with because of this experience. Stephen Covey talks about, Leo Buscaglia talks about, most of Elie Wiesel talks about the importance of having goals in our life to give our life a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And of course you can imagine that I had set myself the goal to hike the trail. I had a goal every day to finish the trail at the end of the day at the night camp and not lose my way. I had a general objective to finish the trail, of course, to finish the 2-month trek. But I began in this last week of hiking, after the Shabbat, to set goals for myself. Personal goals, professional goals, in terms of other activities that I wanted to pursue in my professional career, including a renewed focus on reasserting the legitimacy of Israel in forums on college campuses and political realms around the world with church leaders and others. Helping my friend Yosef Abramowitz to bring renewable electricity to Africa was something that I said to myself, I really want to do this. And I left the job that I was at within a year and a half after finishing the trail and did that. Set myself some personal goals with regard to my family, wanting to be a better father. I had all sorts of other objectives that I started to write into my journal that gave, to a certain extent, a framework of understanding of what it is that I wanted to achieve with my life, having achieved this goal of hiking the Israel Trail. And the truth is that I achieved, I would say, this is a spoiler alert, if you want to read the book, But because we're here, and I already mentioned this to somebody else, and not least because of the situation that we're in, the kind of goals that I had and that I set for myself, I was lucky enough to achieve. And one of them is expressed by this beautiful bouquet of flowers that I found on the Yarkon River. Another example, by the way, if you're looking for a day hike as a group that's very accessible and relatively not strenuous, people don't know that the Israel Trail goes all along the northern edge of the Yarkon River. From North Tel Aviv, the urban side of North Tel Aviv, all the way into areas near the Sharon Canyon and Ramat Chayal, and winding around the Yarkon River to the Mikorot of the Yarkon River in the Parka Yarkon. You find yourself 20 minutes walking, not driving, out of Tel Aviv in the midst of what could be wilderness. And then all of a sudden there's a canyon, a huge building, literally 300 meters away from you, and then you're back into the wilderness. But before we got there, walking along just outside the harbor of Tel Aviv, I came across this trail sign, which I hadn't described before, but I assume many of you are familiar with it, that this is the iconic sign of the trail that you look for as you're hiking. And some of those frustrations that I described before, that I had to forgive myself or the author of the trail guide or the organizers of the trail for, when I lost the trail, sometimes there weren't enough signs. And you end up talking to it, by the way. If you've seen that movie where Tom Hanks talks to the soccer ball, Castaway, I talk to the trail sign all the time. There you are, meeting him, greeting it like an old friend. In this case, when I was approaching this stump of wood, 2 turtle doves, or pigeons, I think they were doves, were fluttering around and landed. And they landed right here. And then they flitted off, and then they came back and landed. 2 of them, you know how they do that. You may know that doves mate for life. Doves, I should say, not doves. We're speaking in English. Doves mate for life. And this thought popped into my head as I watched this pair of doves flittering around and landing here. And I got a little bit sad for a moment. Because I said to myself, they can mate for life, and we couldn't? But that immediately turned for me. I looked at that as a sign and as a symbol, not of sadness that it hadn't worked for me, but here, 7.5 weeks into this trek, having learned these lessons of humility and acceptance, and particularly forgiveness and gratitude for all the wonderful things in my life, I felt at that moment, as I walked away from looking at these doves, that I might be ready to love again. That I might be open. I developed a sense of confidence that I could love again. And it's not a spoiler alert, because she's sitting here to introduce you to Miriam, my wife of 3.5 years, my wonderful and beautiful soulmate, and Ezer Kenegdo, who I met and married in the years after the trail. And I used to tell the story to say that I was confident that I would love again, but of course we never know. What I mean is that in the process of thinking about what my life was going to be, as I set goals for myself in that last week of the trail, this experience helped me to understand that I was open, that it was possible that I was going to love again. I'm going through very quickly some of the last pictures, because as you could see, it wasn't the pictures that was the most important part of the discussion today. They're the backdrop of the experience that I had hiking my Israel Trail. I would imagine and I would hope that within the context of your living here, whether as a group together or as individuals, that you'll have a chance to hike your